Hello, this is Jeremy Elkins with Untreated Art. In this episode, we'll be making an Estuary walnut dining table. I will be making infinity fractal waterfalls on the live edges and pouring teal resin in the rivers. So let's get started. I found the perfect live edge walnut slab up at Stormo Hardwoods in Arlington, Washington. Kevin Stormo, who is the owner, surfaced it flat on both sides and made the trim cuts, so I didn't have to do that before starting the burning process. I knew when I started burning that I wanted the rivers to be very sporadic across the top surface on the table. Starting on one end, I went ahead and started to burn the main river, which I would use as a guide for the tributaries to be added later. I'm using high voltage electricity to burn the rivers into the wood, and as always, I do not recommend trying this at home. If the probes are placed too close to each other, then electricity will just jump across and not burn the rivers. And if they're placed too far apart, then the current can't travel through the wood to connect it and start the burn process. While the electricity is turned off, I'll move the probes around and then turn back on to find that sweet spot between the two that allow it to burn and create the type of rivers that I'm looking for. It's best to think of the wood slab as a blank canvas that you can paint the rivers across in any direction you want. Since it's not possible to wet down the entire slab and burn it from end to end, I get to choose section by section on which direction I would like the main river to flow. On this table, I chose to have it flow left and then come back into the center, go up on the right corner, and then flow back to the center again before getting to the end. In my mind, I was picturing how a river might flow through a valley, curving along the way to create those river bends instead of just a straight thoroughway. Because the electricity will only flow through the areas that I've placed water down on the wood, I get to control the burn at least a little bit. It will stay confined to those wet areas on the wood, but within those boundaries, it is all up to the path of least resistance, which is completely random. But that's what I love about it, because it creates the most unique river patterns every time. At this point in the process, I'm finished with the main river, and I start to create tributaries off of it. This is where I let my imagination go wild and just start burning rivers wherever I feel they need to be. I often get up on a ladder after I stop the electricity from burning, and just look down on the slab and see what it's creating. Get an overall sense of the rivers and how they're connecting and how they're looking. It's a very slow process for me, and I prefer to take my time because there are no redos. You can't stop, erase a river, and start over. It's remove the material out, it's burned, it's gone, and once it's there, you have to live with it. I've made many variations of the estuary design before. Some of them have very few rivers. They might be small tributaries. Others leave islands behind. They're so deep and wide that there's a lot of resin flowing through the top. This is kind of in the middle here, but I wanted to have a lot of rivers flowing left to right without boundaries so that they can tie in with the infinity fractal waterfalls that are on the live edges. To create those waterfalls, I just simply put the probe on the bottom of the live edge and allow it to burn to the top surface where the other rivers already exist. The live edges are tougher to burn than the top surface, but I just do my best and see what happens. Usually it turns out at least close to what I was hoping for. After the burning process is complete, then it's time to start removing out the charred wood left behind. It takes a lot of water to get the electricity to burn the wood, so when I'm finished with the burning process, I have to allow time for it to dry back out. Depending on the size of the slab, that can take several days or maybe even up to a week in a nice dry, warm climate. It is very important to allow the slab to dry back out because we're going to be pouring resin into these rivers, and epoxy and moisture don't mix. I prefer to use a nylon wheel brush to remove the charred wood and either a rotary pneumatic tool or in this case an electric drill. It tends to make a big mess, so I use a vacuum to suck up most of the debris that I can. I've got my air filtration system running overhead, and I've got my respirator on, which I usually have while working on the table anyhow. Once the debris is removed, then you get to see all the unique and creative features left behind by the burn process. Usually while I'm burning, I have no idea what it's going to look like later on, at least when it comes to the ins and outs of each individual river. Even though I've done this a lot, I still don't have any idea what it's going to look like until I get to this point. While burning in each individual river with electricity, at the end it just looks like a burnt slab. But this is where it all comes to life. I use a direct drive sander with 80 grit to remove the top surface, exposing all the individual islands and tributaries. After the resin pour, I will surface both the top and bottom of the slab flat again, but at this point it's still relatively flat, so there's no need to do that. The electricity can leave behind a stain on the top surface as well. I'm not too concerned about removing it all at this point, because it is going to get surfaced again and then finish sanding, but I do try to remove as much of it as I can without dipping into the wood. Now the slab looks completely different with the rivers exposed and the top sanded. It gives you a glimpse of what to expect later on once the resin is poured in. You can also see the difference between the wide central river and the smaller tributaries feeding into it. Some of those burnt areas are up to 1 inch deep, while others are less than 1/4 inch. Usually when you let the electricity burn and create these wider rivers, it also means they're going to be deeper. I'm going to mix up a teal resin for the rivers. It's going to be a 2-part blue, 1-part green, but it's going to be made up of over 8 different mica powders. I never make the same color twice, and that's actually kind of easy to do with so many selections of coloring for mica powders. But I basically mixed in what I wanted, and what I was looking for was a lighter teal. Starting with the fractal waterfalls on the live edges, I pour the resin in and allow it to seep down without creating air pockets. I only fill them up about halfway and then move on to pouring the rest of the rivers. Gravity is going to level out the entire resin pour, and they're going to get filled up completely at the end. I tend to start with the widest, the deepest rivers first. They take the most resin, and the small tributary rivers can actually get filled up once the large rivers overflow. This is just personal preference and how I like to pour the resin, but it doesn't really matter as long as they all get filled in. Because these rivers are so deep, up to 1 inch, I can't use a tabletop resin, so I use a deep pour. This does mean that the cure process will take much longer, but it does give me more working time with the resin to create patterns and the resin art that I like. Earlier when I mixed up the base resin color, which is what I'm pouring right now, that 2-part blue, 1-part green, it's kind of a lighter shade of teal, I also mixed up 3 separate auxiliary colors to be poured in later. There's a dark blue, a light blue, and then a green that I'll be adding in. The reason why I separated these colors and didn't mix it into this base color is because the deep pour resin takes several days to even thicken up. During that length of time, the colors will blend together and just create a new shade of teal. Whereas I want them to be separated from the base color and stand out on their own accord. Because I'll be coming back and adding in those additional auxiliary colors, I make sure to leave room in the rivers so that they're not too full. Otherwise, the epoxy would overflow out of the riverbanks, and that resin on the very top surface would get completely removed during the final surfacing and sanding. Now that all the rivers are full of the base color, it's time to start introducing those auxiliary colors. I start with the green and just swirl it into the base color. Next up was the light blue with a hint of silver pearl. I don't want these colors to be completely off from the base teal, but if you think about the ratio that I use, 2 to 1, 2 parts blue, 1 part green, here I'm doing a green auxiliary color, and then next I'll be introducing that light blue and then a dark blue, which makes up that 2 to 1 mix ratio. I'll come back later and blend them in just a little bit, but when you're standing close up to the resin, you'll be able to see the distinct colors, whereas when you're standing back, say several feet from the table, it's just going to cast off a teal color. This is just the way that I create the resin art. It's what I prefer. It's what my eye is drawn to. But there really isn't a wrong way to do this. You could mix it all together, pour it all at the same time if you wanted to. Once again, I made sure not to overflow the rivers. There's about an 1/8 inch of clearance from the top surface of the wood down to the surface of the resin. And this is because I'm going to come back later on and I'm going to pour on just a clear layer over the top of all the rivers. The reason I do that is I'm trying to preserve the resin art. When I take it and get it surfaced on the top, I don't want to remove any of the coloring resin that creates the resin art. That's why that clear resin will remain on the top surface, but also make it flush with the wood. My favorite tool of choice for mixing in resin art is a popsicle stick. Cheap, you buy it by the thousands, you throw away when you're done, renewable resource, the list goes on and on. But there are plenty of other options out there. I usually tinker with the resin art quite a bit, and sometimes that means I have to bring back and add some more of the base teal, or maybe add more of the auxiliary colors until I'm satisfied with the look of it. Here you can see after I poured that clear resin over the teal, it overflows the riverbanks just a little bit, but that's okay. It will get surfaced off flat and it will protect that resin art underneath. Some of the smallest tributary rivers will only have the clear resin in. That will basically show up as black rivers when it's finished. After several weeks of allowing the resin to cure, it's time to start removing all the fractal waterfall dams and getting ready for surfacing. I start by using a direct drive sander with 80 grit on it. This removes a good portion of that top clear resin, but without getting down to the level of the wood. This is just a real rough sanding before surfacing, and I'll come back later on and work my way all the way up to 400 grit dry sanding after the surfacing is finished. There is a slight cup in the slab after the burning process, and that's because material is being removed out as the rivers are being burned. So they are filled in with resin, but that cup is still there. That's why it's important to surface it flat again and not just sand it. Notice how only a 1/16 of an inch or less is being removed off the top surface, and that's because this can make or break your project. Every pass is important because it removes material, which means that you might lose some rivers that are very shallow on the surface. If I need to remove, say, up to a 1/4 inch of material, I do it one pass at a time at around 30 of an inch, or 1/16 at most. Once the slab is flat again, then I can move back to rough sanding. There's still a lot of excess buildup resin on the waterfalls, so I go back to that 80 grit direct drive sander and remove as much as I can without going too deep into the live edges. I also use the 80 grit on the direct drive to remove the step over lines left behind by the 2-inch bit on the router surfacing table. There wasn't a whole lot of tear out because they were sharp new carbide bits, and generally I do about a 50% step over each pass, which on a nice flat level surfacing table doesn't leave too much of a step over line. I make my final trim cuts to match the dimensions of the table, and I use a fine-tooth blade so it doesn't chip out the epoxy when making the cut. After all the necessary epoxy repairs are made, I can move on to the final sanding, starting with 120 grit on a random orbit. I work my way up the grits from 120 to 220, 300, 400, and that will basically conclude dry sanding. I go through a lot of sandpaper once I get out of 220 in the 300, 400 range, and that's because the epoxy gums up on it quite a bit, even after cleaning. I'm the type of person that would try to reuse sandpaper as much as possible, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not worth it to get swirl marks in your resin. After 400 grit is finished, I raise the grain by applying water to the wood. I'll come back once it dries and hit it again with 400 grit to knock that back down smooth. Once I'm done with 400 grit, I'll give it an air bath, removing any debris, and get it ready for the finish. I like to use a liquid hard wax, which is used on hardwood floors, And it can take a lot of abuse. It's UV resistant, water resistant. Great finish for tables in my opinion. I like to apply 2 to 3 coats, and the first one I drench it on, let it soak in as much as possible. I'll remove the excess and allow it to cure, and then come back and scuff it up with white Scotch-Brite pad, and then apply the next finish and just repeat until the finish is complete. After everything fully cures, I'll come back and wet sand and polish out the resin rivers. Having the resin being a high gloss finish and the wood being a natural matte gives it a real high contrast between the two and is my favorite way to finish these pieces. If I wasn't going to polish out the resin, then at this point the table's finished. That just depends on what the client wants. If the table is going to get a lot of wear and tear and usage every single day, then I wouldn't necessarily recommend the high gloss finish. If it's going to get heavy usage every single day, lots of wear and tear, then I would just recommend the matte finish. Even though I talk to every single one of my clients and try to educate them on this topic so they can choose the right finish, 9 times out of 10 they always go with the high gloss because of the look, and I understand that completely. In my opinion, even though it's going to get some wear and tear, just like anything that's polished, it's worth it. It would really take a lot of damage to get rid of that crystal clear shine on the polished resin. And being able to have the wood in its natural matte state and the resin being high gloss, that contrast between the two is just magical. Everything went great on this project. There was no major issues to speak of. There's always small things that pop up during every step of the process, but that's just the nature of the beast when you're trying something new or creating something new. We are all done making this piece, and that wraps up this episode. Thank you for watching. I look forward to seeing your comments or any questions that you have about making this piece. My name is Jeremy Elkins with Untreated Art, and please subscribe to my YouTube channel @Jeremy Elkins for future videos.